I started together, which is really looking at how do we think about disability as a competitive advantage and how do we frame the disability experience as similar, if not equal, to the entrepreneurship experience. Because as you know, as disabled people, we have to figure out how do we get dressed, how we drive, how we communicate, and that requires a level of tenacity, resiliency that is mirror, if not equal, to the one in entrepreneurship.
Welcome to the Canary Report, the podcast where risk leaders, safety professionals, and operational executives come for real-world stories and smarter strategies to keep people safe. I'm your host, Michael Zhao. In each episode, I sit down with exceptional leaders who are transforming how risk and safety are managed. Whether you're a leader of a nationwide EH&S program in a high-risk industry, or you champion workplace safety across 200 retail locations, this podcast is for you. Let's get into it. Welcome to the Canary Report, the podcast where risk leaders and safety professionals and operational executives come for real-world stories and strategies around keeping people safe. I am your host, Michael Zhao, the CEO and founder of Yellowbird. I am absolutely delighted to have a special episode today. A dear friend, a advisor, a mentor of mine, an advocate for the disability community, and frankly, just one of the best human beings that I know, Diego Mariscal, an entrepreneur, a disability advocate, the founder and CEO and chief disabled person at Together International. A little bit of background on Diego. Not only have I been honored to be a entrepreneur in residence with the Together International program for disabled entrepreneurs and those serving the disability community, but I also know Diego from his work over a decade of disability and inclusion work. He has accelerated over 80 startups. He has raised over $70 million in funding. You have absolutely done remarkable work with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission on being an advocate and an advisor to them, working with the Hillary Clinton and Foundation and Joe Biden as an advocate on policy of empowerment. And most importantly, you are just a remarkable, kind human. And I am so happy that you could come on the podcast with us today. So thank you, Diego. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
So I want to kick this off with your early years and what brought you. One, I know you are not originally from the United States, so you started you're from Mexico, correct?
Correct.
So tell us about your upbringing, your life, your family. I know your family is very important to you. You've got a very close family. I love that. And, your disability and kind of how that journey has begun with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to share. We got to get you some updated numbers because we're doing a lot better now, which is great.
Well, those are big numbers to begin with, so even better. I love that.
Yes. But yeah, our journey. So my journey started. I'll tell you from the very beginning. So I was actually born in the States,
Okay.
by accident. So my parents were shopping, and I was born 6 months and a half into my mom's pregnancy.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, pretty tiny baby. She jokes and says that I've always been really stubborn. Even before I was born, I wanted to get out quickly. And that's why I call myself really from Mexico, right? Because my whole life I grew up in Mexico, and I think the proper academic term is like global nomad. Those
Sure.
people who are born in the States but actually are raised in another country. And I had the fortune of growing up specifically in Monterrey, Mexico, which if you know anything about Mexican geography, you'll know that Monterrey, Mexico is sort of the Silicon Valley of Mexico. And so I was exposed to entrepreneurship at a very early age, even before people knew how to spell the word entrepreneur. My high school had a motto that was a culture of entrepreneurship, and they certainly lived up to that name. They would allow us, for example, something that was very natural to me, but soon learned that was definitely an anomaly, at least here in the States. But we were allowed to skip as many classes as we wanted, so long as we were working in service of learning. And then we had to write a report or had to explain to the professors why we would skip school. And obviously we had to make up the work. So it wasn't like we were, totally skipping, but the professors had to allow you to miss classes if you had somewhere to be, using quotation marks. And so I got an award in school for being the most absent from classes.
Oh,
Yeah.
awesome. And at what level of schooling was this?
This was in high school. This was in
In
high
high school.
school.
Okay.
They very much encouraged people to be entrepreneurial. I started my first company when I was there. It was all about educating students about what it's like to have disability. So we would do things like eating without being able to see, or using public transportation in a wheelchair, or communicating without speaking. And we ultimately sold it back to the school, and it's still um, one of the largest youth-led programs around disability education. So with that background, my dad's actually also an entrepreneur, and so, exposed to that as well. Moved to DC thinking that I was going to do anything but what my dad does. I was like, as far away, policy, going to change the world that way. Got to DC, was very surprised by the fact that disability inclusion was very much still much more behind than I expected, especially growing up in Mexico. And so we were still talking about unemployment rates, lack of inclusion of people with disabilities in the media, et cetera, et cetera. And so with that, because I had this entrepreneurship background, I started Together, which is really looking at how do we think about disability as a competitive advantage, and how do we frame the disability experience as similar, if not equal, to the entrepreneurship experience. Because, as you know, right, as disabled people, we have to figure out how do we get dressed, how we drive, how we communicate. And that requires a level of tenacity, resiliency that is mirror, if not equal, to the one in entrepreneurship. So it's been a journey for sure, but it's been a great one.
Fantastic. So you went to DC. Did you you went to DC for school, right? What were you studying? And I know that you were very active in the community there. What were you studying, and under whom, and so forth?
Yeah, so there's a theme here. So I was studying international relations, and I was actually kicked out of school for skipping classes. This time I didn't get an award. This time I got
No
kicked out.
award. No award for that.
No award.
Yeah,
It was a big, honestly, it was a big culture shock for me. I
sure.
coming from Mexico, I thought, oh, of course, like, schools is going to be more progressive. And I didn't
Yeah.
really, they told me I was on probation. I didn't really understand what that was. Um,
Yes. Yes.
it took a big, I think I'm still adjusting in some ways, right? Culturally. Um, and so was kicked out of school. Thankfully, it all worked out, right? 2 years later, I went back, and then I finished um, in entrepreneurship and innovation. It took me 10 years to graduate, but we did it. And now I'm looking into a master's at Columbia University. So the um, always a learner, right? Always learning. So
Love that. It's so interesting you should say, because I speak about this a fair amount, as you know. I mean, I love having you on here because you've heard my different discussions and the work that I try to do to support, people who have challenges. And I believe, just as you do, that when you are raised that every single day you are overcoming these micro challenges in life, you kind of prepare yourself for being successful. You prepare yourself for adapting and pivoting, and people will call it perhaps human superpowers of just being able to let things bounce off of your back. And you and I were talking about, and I won't use names, but before we got on, you were talking about how, we both hire people that are often question us and push back on us, and sometimes aren't even the most polite in the way that they do it. And yet it's important for us as people. I think we kind of thrive in that environment of a little bit of friction, a little bit of, if life is too easy, it's boring, right? And not that either one of us has too much of that in our worlds right now, but so along those lines, tell me how you ended up founding, Together International, and update me on the numbers. I'm wrong on the numbers. I want to hear what you're doing, and what your mission is, and just tell our listeners about the journey.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, what inspired me, and I'm giving you kind of the detailed version, but really was after being kicked out of school. Well, I had started Together while in school, right? But not really with the idea of supporting entrepreneurs with disabilities. I was really, and it's still the core of what we do. At the core, what we do is we think about how do we change the way society, the world thinks about people with disabilities. We just so happen to do it through supporting entrepreneurs with disabilities. But the real change is really changing perceptions. And that has never changed from when I started Together. So the first iteration was working in schools because that was my experience. I had built a company in schools, and so we try to sort of replicate what I had done in Mexico at a bigger scale. And what I realized was we were doing that work based on simulations. So we would do things like eating without being able to see, or using public transportation in a wheelchair, or communicating without speaking. And that was a way to get students to learn about disability in a very fun and
Yeah,
didactic way that maybe they hadn't been exposed to before.
right.
That worked in Mexico. That did not work in the US.
Sure,
People, I think rightfully so, started comparing, especially at the college level, because at this point I was in college.
sure,
Rightfully so, starting comparing it to blackface, right? And what does that mean? And the fact that you simulate a disability doesn't really mean that you fully understand. And at that point, I was being more embedded into the disability rights movement. That's where
sure.
I met people like Judy Heumann,
Yes,
other big leaders. And I learned about this concept, which I still very much believe in, which is nothing about us without us, right?
yes,
Which is this idea that if you're gonna work with for people with disabilities, they need to be front and center in the work that's been done. And so I realized this can be a great idea, great company, but there's really no disabled people participating, right? Like the simulations weren't necessarily for disabled people. It was a bunch of non-disabled people sort of deciding. And so I've always been very stubborn, even before I was born, right? And so it took me 2 years. It took me 2 years to really, recognize that, "Hey, this isn't the path." And so after that, we said, "Okay, let's focus on advocacy campaigns." I don't know how familiar your listeners are or you are with there's this organization called DoSomething.org. And what they do is they use the power of technology to get young people to do good stuff offline. So they use online tools to get people to do good stuff offline. Think about like volunteerism, things like that. And so I thought, that's a very interesting concept. Can we do the same? Can we take the same principle, get online tools and help disabled people, do good work offline? And so we did campaigns. We did a police brutality campaign. We did an education campaign. And everybody would tell me, and these were like 3-month campaigns, really, short periods of time. And people came up to me and said, "We love your campaigns. They're really nice, really important, but we need a job. We we need to make money, right?" And I thought, hmm, why don't we do an entrepreneurship campaign? And actually, I didn't plan this. This was the this was the name of the campaign. Disability Project in Power was the name of the campaign. And as soon as we did that, for every campaign in the early days, we would get maybe 10, 15 signups. And that was good to do small campaign to have impact. For this one campaign on entrepreneurship, we had 50 signups in one swoop. And so I was like, I think we've hit a nerve here.
Yeah.
And so we pivoted and just to focus on entrepreneurship. And that's been the focus ever since. And I'm thankful for it. And what's interesting is now I do almost the exact same job that my dad does. So the same apple doesn't fall from the tree is very
I've catch myself also doing things that my father does. Not only he was not an entrepreneur, but our focus and our stubbornness and our inability to stop. I find myself at times going, "Oh my goodness, I see my father in myself," and there are very many times that I'm very proud of that, and there are times that I'm like, "Oh my goodness, I don't want that." So and I'm certain that my children are going to do the same thing about me. So it's funny because one of the reasons I have had a difficult time being a disabled entrepreneur is that a lot of the times then you're trying to build a thesis that will help a community, the money availability is not there unless you go all in to a not-for-profit methodology or you do it as a side project for a profitable business. And so a lot of impact investors and folks who claim that they're going to support those who have disabilities and or other type of impact will really fall back on the basic thesis around unit economics, business 101 type of things. Are you finding that as well as you have your accelerated companies? I don't know how many have gone through now. It said 80, but I think you've done more than that now. So like, are you finding that post graduation that I know that you guys do the $10,000 competition at the end of each of your cohorts, and it's a great kickoff. We're quite larger now, but we still struggle because I want to do more disability work and I can't.
It's challenging. And I will say that access to capital still, I think a big challenge. And I can share before we were officially on, I was sharing that we're starting the first ever fund for specifically for founders with disabilities. We're raising a $40 million fund, and we already have a $20 million anchor. So super proud of that. If anybody listening wants to join the wagon, please find me after. Um,
Wonderful.
but for sure, I mean, access to capital is, and it's in some ways a vicious cycle, right? Because disabled people are unemployed. We tend to be at a higher rate of poverty,
Mm-hmm.
high rate of unemployment all over the world, including the US, right? And so
Sure.
that lends itself to fewer wealth opportunities for people to invest and for people to support other founders, et cetera, et cetera. On the flip side, though, when you think about the most famous entrepreneurs, Richard Branson, Bill Gates, whether you love him or hate him, Elon Musk, you know, all these people have come out as having a disability later in life. Um, but that only happens currently after they gain some success and notoriety, because the underlining way in which we think about disability is still from a cure perspective, from a charitable perspective, to your point, right? And so I think the work that we're doing is critical in saying, hey, you're actually not going to be successful in spite of your disability. You're going to be successful in many ways because of your disability, and highlighting that perspective is critical.
I think that is a fantastic framing of this. I think one of the challenges that a lot of entrepreneurs that can see their technology being used for good, and I'll use myself as an example. So Yellowbird, as anybody who's listened to this podcast know, we use AI to find out about our professionals at a very deep level of their competencies and capabilities so that they can do work in health and safety for profit. But the function of what we do, which is streamlining coordination, streamlining scheduling, and making things available, take that lens and take it into a caregiver's network, or for somebody who does sign language, for somebody who doesn't have the ability to do, who needs a signer, or for somebody who is offering services. Everything that I do in the for-profit world of wisdom and knowledge workers to better deploy could be used in this environment. And I'm super excited at some point of doing that. But we have to basically treat it like a side project, fun to have, no funding goes there. If you show too much energy towards that, the investment community says, whoa, hold on a second, that's going to affect your P&L. Well, what's the side project that you're doing? I said, it's for the good of the world. I believe in this. I'm passionate about this. And yet you have to make a decision. And I've had to make a decision to not pursue that. And it's a shame, because then when you get somebody who has a disability focused fund, they'll say, well, we want to see some traction in this area. Like, I can't show you traction in the area because I wasn't allowed to do it.
No, so 100% agree. And I think that that's been one of the strongest convictions that we've had to do as an organization ourselves. We have the advantage, I'm using quotations again, that we are a non-for-profit ourselves. And so I think that allows us the flexibility to, we very much think as a for-profit company, right? When we think about profit margins, efficiency, people, talent, all of those things. But at the end of the day, we have that flexibility, again, quotations, of not responding to shareholders, right? And really maximizing impact. But to your point, we've been told many, many times, hey, why don't you broaden the scope of Together International? Why don't you focus on accessibility? Or, and you and I know funds and investors that are focusing the accessibility space. And I have been very adamant about no, no, no. We're going to be focusing on exclusively founders with disabilities. And that is precisely to your point, so that it doesn't detract from the core focus of our business, which is wanting to support and see disabled people at the front and center of the change that we want to see.
Yes. It's one of the most inspiring trips that I've taken in maybe the last decade was our trip that we took to, where were we? With
Topeka?
Topeka, Kansas.
Kansas.
Yeah, we were in Topeka, Kansas, and we met the founders of two. I think they both had autism, correct?
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah, and they built these very successful companies with the help of the community and the help of their parents and the support of all of us. Do you recall what that adventure was? I remember sitting on the panel. I remember being involved. I loved it. What was that? What was that event that we were there for?
So it was focused around Kansas and what Kansas could be doing to support employment. And one of the focuses was entrepreneurship. And we were talking about entrepreneurship. Michael, the follow-up to that, actually, I think you'll appreciate this. So if you remember, Kaufman Foundation was one of the panelists. And Kaufman Foundation has been a strong leader in the entrepreneurship space nationally. But they recognized that they didn't know, or they hadn't done a lot of work in the disability space. And so that was one of the first times that one of their senior staff members was talking about disability. And very powerfully, she recognized that in her own family, she had a person with a disability who was facing some of the same issues that we were discussing in the panel. And so as a result of that conversation and some others that we had too, we received a grant earlier this year to continue the work with Kaufman and to really look at expanding the work that we're doing both in Kansas and nationally. But it's the reason why those conversations and those convenings are so important. They shed light in issues that oftentimes people don't know or don't recognize.
Yes, it is. I remember so clearly sitting up there and being so proud to be part of this community. And we had every different sort of human, both from a nationality perspective, from an ability perspective, from a background perspective, all with the same lens of empowerment. And in my lens, the way I look at innovation is understanding your market and serving your market and having your market come back with appreciation, both in the willingness to do business with you, but also transforming how they view, maybe something that they were closed off to. So, what is going to happen over the coming next 6 months? What are you focused on, Diego? How can we, as a listener group, again, my listeners are very much in the environmental health and safety world. We're in Sadly, a lot of the people who are affected by environmental health and safety sometimes end up with a disability because of the things that we are trying to prevent not happening. And sometimes it's just part of the journey in life. So I know that everybody's going to listen to this and say they have somebody that they either know or recognize. And that's part of this journey, is telling people about, look, a disability is not always what you think it is. And it's not always a negative. In fact, most of the time it's not. So what are you doing with your organization? I know you're raising this fund. I'm super excited about that. Hopefully we can in some way support it and or be one of your organizations. But beyond that, what else are you doing?
Yeah, so two things. One is you mentioned the fund, and I think what's unique about this fund is it's a vehicle that can take in both philanthropic capital, because we're a non-for-profit philanthropic capital, and traditional investment capital. So it's the first of its kind in that sense. Which is awesome because, if anybody's interested to make an investment on either side, we have the ability to recognize that. But then, two, I presume that many of your listeners are may also be thinking about starting a business, or perhaps they own a business. And so, knowing that we are a resource for you all if you identify as having a disability and you want to explore, and I didn't really get deep into this, but we have various programs depending on the level of uh, stage that you are at. So you went through the accelerator program, Michael, but we have also for those who are in the idea stage, or perhaps just want to dabble into community. So wherever your journey is, we're here to help. And so I'm happy to be a resource for anyone and everyone who's listening, who might be interested in pursuing that journey.
Fantastic. Well, and I can tell you, as an entrepreneur in residence, after going through the journey, when I first came on, and we were a little bit ahead in our evolution, we were probably a little bit more seasoned than most that start in the journey. A lot of these are concepts at that stage. Now, this was 5 years ago. We're 6 years in, so I was only a year into it. But we were already in revenue, and we were already, kind of accelerating. But I'll tell you, having a community is so important. And it doesn't matter what your community necessarily is, just the ability to bounce things off of each other and have people who are willing to be helpful. Um, I can tell you one of the most rewarding things that I've done, and I look forward to doing it again, which is being an entrepreneur in residence, because I can help people avoid challenges that they may, or even just ask questions. And everybody says there are no stupid questions, but the reality is there are questions that you don't feel comfortable asking your, your investors. right? Or your team, and being honest about the things that you may not be good at or able to do, and looking at that as an honest way of saying, I recognize the help I need. And I think that was the most powerful thing that I found is as I was mentoring and working with these entrepreneurs of all different sorts. And by the way, just for clarity, just like every other cohort of entrepreneurs, just because you have a disability does not mean that you're going to be, and it is a superpower and it is going to help you be resilient. Great ideas rise. Not all businesses make it. That is true, whether you are a multi-time founder or whether or not you have any type of group. There will be a percentage that just aren't great ideas or just before they've come, and that's okay. It's interesting, but I'll tell you, Diego, your cohorts have been very special to me. So I want to thank you so much. So are you doing anything internationally? So looking at policy, and I also want to talk to you a little bit about the policy. Before we go into the international piece of the equation, do you have any thoughts or updates on what happens with people's services and monies that they receive if they become more independent where they are above the poverty line? Has there been any changes or anything happening there? I remember thinking to myself how unfair and how unjust it is that you start to build self-sufficiency and you get just above the poverty line, and then all of a sudden you're at risk of losing your benefits that you need. Has there been any modifications or changes in that space?
So that's a huge challenge within the disability community, and it's a it's what a poverty trap that perpetually keeps disabled people in a poverty cycle. And so what I can share from experience is that's one of the beauties of being an entrepreneur is that when you start making money, especially if you set up a corporation, and that's one of the things that we as an accelerator can help people do is if you set up a corporation, you can actually protect your earnings and your assets so that they don't go directly to you. They go to the corporation. And so technically the earner is not you, is a corporation. And so that's a way around it in some there are nuances, but that I'm giving you call the simplified version. And then the other side is a vehicle called Able Accounts, and I believe we might have explore Able Accounts even in the panel that we were at. These are accounts that anybody who acquired a disability before the age of 26, and I believe federally that's changing soon, if not already changed to 40, but it'll be 40 at some point. I don't know if it
Sure,
is
sure,
or will be, but essentially anybody who acquired a disability before the age of 26 as of now um, is eligible for these able accounts, and these are savings accounts where you are allowed to save money in such a way that it does not um, disrupt your benefits. So I am an able account user.
sure.
I've done really, really well. You know, the company is growing. I still
Yeah,
receive Medicaid services, and I wouldn't be able to have the level of independence I have if it weren't because of those services that I continue to receive in various state by state. And that's one of the things that we can help with. Think about benefits and connect you with the right persons. And what I would encourage people to think about is a lot of times when we have these conversations, people immediately think, oh, I need to talk to a benefits counselor. And they go and they talk to a benefits counselor. And the reality is, yes, benefits counselors are important and you should be informed. The flip side is that they tend to speak another language. They will not necessarily totally, be eh, speak in simplified terms or talk in a way that somebody who is not in the finance world or in the tax world, would understand. And so my recommendation, and this is something we do too in the accelerator, is yes, work with the financial with a benefits planner, but also have a circle of advisors and entrepreneurs that have gone through that experience that can share, this is how I handled it, this is what I did, because it also varies state by state. And so what might be applicable to me might not be applicable to you depending on the state. Uh, so having that circle of peers to talk about many things, but one of the things being how do we handle this specific issue, I think is very critical.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. That was very, very helpful. And I think that our listeners, again, we all have a community around us that has some level of a disability, some level of challenge. And I don't know a single person who gets out of this game unscathed. We all have our various challenges. And so I want to kind of wrap up the discussion around things that you're seeing through this journey of yours for that are making big differences in the world of both entrepreneurism, but specifically those with disabilities. Are you seeing any interesting programs? Are you seeing any interesting technologies? What's happening out there that's helping our community get more support?
Certainly our alums, right? And I can go in you, Eric Ingram, Keely Catwell. I mean, the all incredible founders that are working on incredible startups. Um, I think the thing to highlight and remember. So two things. One, the startup specifically, thinking about how when we create or work in the accessibility space or with a disability community in mind, that has wider adoption, right? So think about the curb cuts, or think about iPhones or smartphones. That technology was built for people who are blind. Curb cuts, what was built for people who are in a wheelchair. Audiobooks were also created for people who are blind. So, and these are now being widely adopted, right? And so there's a huge opportunity in that space. So leaning into that, I think, is very important. The other side, kind of, um, the other side, and you kind of talked about it a little bit through your questions, is what's happening in the ecosystem level. So on that, I think is to me very interesting because it's systems change, and so because of the work that we've been doing in the U.S. particularly, now we have a partnership with the Inter-American Development Bank. And for those of you who might not know, the Inter-American Development Bank is, think of it as the World Bank, but for Latin America specifically. So they
Okay.
do development projects in the 26 countries in the region, in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so
Okay.
we've been able to take the model that we've implemented in the US and translate it into both Spanish, Portuguese, and cultural translations, right?
Awesome.
Um, so that's system level work at the highest level. That's changing policy, data collection, all of that piece.
Sure.
You mentioned I serve on the SEC, and so looking at how is the investment community at the highest level, the SEC Securities and Exchange Commission, thinking about these questions of benefits, and how disabled people live in this perpetual poverty trap. So my point being that yes, the startups are creating incredible innovations in and of itself, and at the same time, the movement is moving towards this greater ecosystem impact. And so both that yin and yang are critical if we really want to change the way people think about disability.
I love the fact that you are able to work with one person to help them become the entrepreneur they want to be, Diego. And you can work with the SEC and the World Bank level people. You have an amazing knack for being an exceptional advocate. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate you, man. And I I'm going to wrap today by one, asking anybody who is able and willing to support the Together International community It's Together International. So the number two, together.
Two with the number two, yeah.
Yeah, the number together-international.com. And
.org.
look up .org, pardon me. So it's together-international.org. And I am just so proud of you, man. I've been part of this community, your community, for coming on 5 years. And I every time I talk to you, my energy increases. I love that you can do well while doing good. It is what I aspire to always try and do. I don't always have the support that I need to do it, but I still do it in my way, like having you on the podcast. And, I thank you so much for all that you do. So with that, I'm going to say have a wonderful evening, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me, my friend. It's been really great.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode of the Canary Report. If this conversation helped you reframe how you think about risk and safety, please do me a favor. Hit subscribe, leave a review, and share it with somebody who needs to hear it. We're building a new category of safety and risk leadership, one that's faster and smarter. Leaders who aren't just empowered by tech, but whose wisdom is accelerated by it. To learn more about how Yellowbird's cutting-edge platform is empowering leaders to solve workplace safety and risk challenges faster, smarter, and at scale, visit goyellowbird.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Yellowbird pages to stay up to date. Until next time, lead with clarity, know first, and act fast.